Hello there folks, I'm Dan Brown from sortofinteresting.com and today you are joining me on board good old Narrowboat Abel's Ark for a chat about preparing for boat life during the winter months. And more specifically, I want to share with you a few thoughts on me preparing for my 5th winter afloat and my first winter on board Abel's Ark. And as you can imagine, after spending 4 winters on a boat already, I've learnt an awful lot of lessons, especially as that boat that I used to live on had only 15 feet of indoor space. So living in those close quarters, where you had all sorts of wild weather conditions going on outside for months on end, well, that wasn't just a lesson about boat life, that was a lesson about life, I can tell you. And it was great fun for the most part too. So anyway, diving straight in, I'm going to try and keep this as a fast-paced, focused, information and thought-heavy video, rather than waffling on like I'm already doing. So, firstly, you're going to have the basic things that you should be thinking about, whether you're living in a car, on a boat, in a caravan, etc. So that's things like, what does your engine manual say about antifreeze in your engine? Does it say use it at all? Does it say use a certain percentage of, say, like 25% or 5 parts water to 1 part antifreeze or something like that? See what it says and obviously follow that advice and instruction as best you can. Somebody once told me in the first few days of my boat life when I was asking for advice, said the important thing to do is to never be the man who knows everything. If the manual says this, if an expert who knows more about something says do this, then don't go, oh no, I'll just, yeah, if I just put any old oil in the engine, that'll be okay. Whatever it says, follow that advice and don't think that you know everything. Obviously, things like water pipes. Have you got any water pipes that are potentially more at risk than others? Is there any way you can insulate them? If so, then obviously do so. Something simple as well, like if you're doing long days, if you're doing like working 12-hour shifts with a commute there and the commute back, obviously you've got the potential of the boat getting very cold while you're away and potentially having the pipes freeze while you're just away at work or overnight. For example, I'm going to be going away for a few days on holiday in a couple of weeks' time, so before I do so, I'm going to run as much water out of the pipes on the boat as I can. Then I'm going to make sure that when I leave, the water pump is switched off, because the last thing I would want to come home to is the situation where potentially the water pipe has frozen, burst, and then the water pump has detected that drop in pressure and acted as if a tap had been switched on and just started to pump, well, literally 200 litres of water, just gallons and gallons of water, straight into the inside of your boat, which if that pipe's above your furniture, above your bed, something like that, not only is that going to potentially ruin your furniture and your walls and stuff like that and getting all the wood that might be on the inside of your boat, it's going to go over the floor and it's going to sink and settle below the floorboards on the inside of the boat, which is certainly, as I say, not something I would want to come back home to. And even if I was on board and saw it happening, I don't think it would please me too much having to quickly turn the pump off. But again, those are realistic things that could potentially happen if you ended up, say if you left the boat and ended up stopping the night at your friend's house like I sometimes do. Obviously, if I come back in the morning and I'm thinking, oh no, I left the water pump on, oh no, there's loads of water in there, I didn't run the pipes out and stuff. Again, simple things like that to think about that are easily overlooked and easy to forget in the heat of the moment. As I say, you might get distracted and just leave the pump on when you go out or something like that. Something that I really believe now, and this is something that I genuinely think from my time on Narrowboat Tilly is a great lesson that I've taken away for life in general, but being prepared for when things potentially go wrong. And I'm not talking about like being some sort of action hero with every sort of knowledge on martial arts and first aid and stuff like that. I'm talking about things like, for example, even now, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, a big tree has fallen over the canal just a few miles on the outskirts of Llangollen. So obviously, if your boat's on the top end there, then you're stuck around the basin area. Luckily, Llangollen, the village, is only a very short walk. Well, you're pretty much moored up in the village. But you've obviously got supplies and things like that you can go down and get, so you're not stranded in the middle of nowhere. However, my first winter on board Narrowboat Tilly, I literally was amazed to see just trees fall down everywhere in the snow. And a tree fell down on the boat that was in front of me at one point, which you can imagine is terrifying and caused all sorts of chaos. But realistically, again, you've got to think about stuff like that. If you get stuck out in the middle of nowhere, where you can't easily get things like coal and wood for the fire, you could you could end up being very, very cold, basically. Because if you've got a situation where there's heavy snow and it's difficult for cars and vehicles to get to the nearest bridge to load you up with coal on a little truck to fetch down to your boat, then that's potentially a serious problem. Equally, things like food and water, keeping plenty of dried goods on board, I mean, that seems to me like a great idea over the winter months, because again, if you're miles and miles of snowy towpath away from the nearest shops to stock up, you're potentially looking at some very cold, wet feet to get yourself a packet of fish and chips, or being very hungry and very cold until the obstructions are cleared in the canal. And again, it's not just trees. I mean, many of you will be familiar with the huge breach that happened out towards Middlewich, I believe it was, where the canal just the bank just completely collapsed, and for months the canal was drained in this section. And you can imagine that happening in the middle of a winter, where you're then stuck somewhere downstream and you're waiting for them to even just put water back in the canal so you can move the boat at all, yet alone actually think about moving the boat any distance when the breach is fixed and so on. So again, things like that you've got to really think about, and you've got to make sure that you're well prepared on board. And hopefully you might have seen some of the preparations that I've got on board with that little time lapse that I hope was on screen at some point. So things like that, again, being prepared, making sure that you've got emergency fuel for the fire, making sure that you've got a good amount of diesel in your tank for the engine, making sure that you've got food on board. Other really simple things to overlook are things like warm and plenty of changes of clothing, basically. So something that I try and do is basically, sorry about that, I thought this would be quite funny, but it's probably not, is it? Anyway, in all seriousness though, things like warm clothing, and lots of it, is obviously very handy. But if you're going out and getting potentially soaking wet all the time in a record-breakingly wet winter, such as the last one that I had when I was living on Narrowboat Tilly, we had unprecedented flooding across the UK, flooding in places that didn't have floods in living memory, and literally like bridges being washed away on rivers, just weather that you wouldn't typically associate with the winter in the UK. And you can imagine when we literally went for a period of months where I didn't see a day where we didn't have at least some rain, the towpaths turned to mud, and you can imagine just every time I was commuting in and out of work or going to see my friends and family, I was getting soaked on my bike. And so what I try and do, and it's something that I really did learn to do when I hit that winter on Narrowboat Tilly, is keep a fresh set of clothing at there's two of my friends' houses. That's two. Then obviously my mum's house and my nan and granddad's house and my dad's house, and it might only be just something like a pair of almost like pyjama sort of clothes, like shorts and t-shirts, something like that. But basically just something that if I biked out to see them, I could get changed and leave me wet clothes on a radiator and then get changed back out of them, so I didn't have to sit in wet clothes, and then put me wet stuff back on to get on my bike, get wet again to come back to the boat, and then change into another set of clothing. And again, that fetches all sorts of problems, as you can imagine, like trying to dry your wet clothes in front of the fire and bringing the humidity and the steam and the damp and condensation into the boat. But a good example of being prepared on my level is, and all these sorts of things you get cheap on Amazon these days, but I've got this as a very thin layer that covers over obviously all of my face and stuff and my ears, but it's a very thin layer so that when I'm on my bike I can easily get my bike helmet on over the top of this, and the helmet straps aren't pulling at different levels because this is shaped to go with my face. So obviously something like that's very handy for when I'm cycling all the time. Then I've also got this sort of tube style one, where the bottom of it is a thick sort of more scarfy woolly material, and the top is a much more stretchy thin material, which again you can use to put up all over like your head, and depending on how you want it to be. And then equally, I've of course got a proper woolly balaclava, which is like nicely lined on the inside, and as you can see, woolly on the outside. So something like this, again, hugely important, and so important to me to have sort of full head coverings if I'm doing very cold walks in the evenings or mornings, or just on a cold winter's day at any time. If I've got to walk a mile or two to the nearest shop to get a few supplies, then obviously I want to make sure that I've got multiple options for the same similar sort of stuff. So if one's soaked through, if I forget one, or if I lose one in the canal or something, I've got this option to just load up and put on another very similar garment. But as I say, for the sake of getting stuff like this for a couple of quid from Amazon, it just seems senseless to not have a couple of backup items. And again, that might be me being obsessive and worrying, but like I say, after 4 years on board Narrowboat Tilly during the winters, I would rather be overcautious and have more that I don't use than need them and not have it. I suppose that's what it comes down to. Similar with stocking up for the winter with the food and water and heating. It's better to keep these extra supplies on board and potentially not use them and not have to use them, and make sure that if, say, like you've got 4 bags of coal and you get the option like you've used maybe 2 of them, and then suddenly you can go, oh, I can pick up 2 bags of coal, and then put yourself back up to 4, rather than obviously use all 4 and then panic about replacing them when you've almost run out. I mean, again, I suppose it's common sense really. Anyway, yeah. Just a few random thoughts there. I hope you've enjoyed some of the footage that's been on screen while I've been wittering away at you. I apologise for endlessly talking like I do in these videos, and I hope that you'll enjoy an upcoming video that I've got talking specifically about keeping the fire going and stocking the fire up, and how I control the fire during the winter months. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed that, and it might have given you some food for thought about boat life during the winter months. Maybe not, but ultimately please do check out my other videos. I've got hundreds of videos from when I lived on Narrowboat Tilly in the past, and some amazing winter videos and footage in those. Feel free also to subscribe, hit the notification bell so that YouTube will hopefully tell you when I post a new video. And please do consider checking out my short boat life books available for the Kindle and as a paperback. It really does help me out, and they do go a huge way to funding buying laptops and cameras and phones to record all these videos on. So it really does mean a huge amount to me, so thank you very much for all the support with my books. And check the links in the description, you'll find links to the books. Find me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and things like that. And well, until the next time, my friends, as always, have an absolutely fantastic day. Keep it interesting, keep it boat worthy, and of course, my friends, farewell.